Hey there friends, Dave Paulides, Can-Am Missing Project copyrighted edition for our video channel. And yes, the iconic UFO poster. For the older people in the audience, the ones that are fans of the X-Files, this is the one that was in Mulder's office. And yes, it is in my office. It has been for years. And it's not that I want to believe. I do believe. And I think to that end, you got to be smart about this. And what do I mean by smart? I mean, you got to think rational. And when you say rational, I guess rational to one isn't rational to the other. But to me, does that mean that you want to believe that there's extraterrestrials or ultra-terrestrials? Meaning people that live right here on Earth? Are entities living right here on Earth that may be visiting us daily? I think it makes a lot more sense. But a little background story. When I was doing a book tour of Australia, Angie and I were in Brisbane and we had a day free and we drove around, saw the sights, and we were starving. So we stopped in this mall and we knew they had a food court, so we'd find something there that was juicy to eat. We were looking for some fish. We're in Australia. As we're walking through the mall, that poster is in the window at this, I don't know, like 5 and dime store. And I've never seen it before for sale anywhere. And I told Angie, I go, you're not going to understand this, but I want that poster. And she goes, we're in Australia. I go, I know. I went in there and I bought it. And yeah, I lugged it around Australia and I brought it all the way home. So that's my one memento from Australia. Now, the funny thing about that, and you talk about coincidence, the people that sponsored the tour of Australia was MUFON Australia. And they had me stopping at multiple places and talk to different MUFON groups. It was awesome. And the people were outstanding. There was only one little hiccup in Australia with the UFO segment. First of all, there's a lot of UFOs in Australia. And that's why MUFON is an active group. But Australia is a place where I broke my leg hiking, slipped on a rock, fell. I literally broke my leg. I didn't know at the time, but it's about this. My ankle and lower leg was about the size of a small cantaloupe. And I told Angie, we're not going to go see a doctor here because I don't want to get it all cast up and have him tell me I'm not going to do this and that. And we've got a lot of work to do. So I hobbled around, and this is a true story. We're in Brisbane, and we're at this meeting. This has never happened before. It's about, 100 people in this room. And I'm sitting on this table, kind of like I'm sitting talking to you sideways, answering questions. And there's somebody in the front row who's obviously intoxicated, and it's a guy that's about 40 years old. And he's heckling me. I don't even know who he is. And he wasn't making any sense about what he was saying, but it really didn't matter. And his heckling got worse and worse and worse. And remember, I got a broken leg. It's not casted up or anything. I could barely move. And this guy gets up at one point and starts walking the 20 feet towards me, screaming at me and yelling at me. I'm thinking, okay, one of these guys in the front row is going to stop this guy. No! So I think, uh-oh, I better stand up. And there's this one really nice older lady that ran the group. She was probably 65, 70 years old. She gets up, grabs this guy's arm, and starts pulling him to the back of the room. This is true. I'm in no condition to do anything. I can barely stand on one leg. And she pulls him out of the back of the room and pulls him out, closes the door, and he's gone. And I thought, well, that's a fine howdy do to UFO Australia. Oh boy. But we're here to talk about UFOs. There's a couple things I need to tell you about. First of all, again, we're still going to this background a little bit. There's a group called NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And it was founded in 1950s to research reports of UFO phenomena. Between 57 and 69, NICAP and its members periodically communicated with the FBI. And in the X-Files, they talk about NICAP a lot because they were really the first private group that researched UFOs. And they did some interesting work. And they were really looking for direction from the FBI, and they communicated with them, sent them a lot of letters. Nothing big happened. But on the FBI website, it says, in 1947, a rash of sightings of unexplained flying objects swept America. Although the newly formed U.S. Air Force, they were newly formed in 47, was the primary investigator of these sightings, the FBI received many reports and worked for a time with the Air Force to investigate these matters. This release details the FBI's role in investigating such reports between 47 and 54. This was all new, folks. Really on uncharted waters at this point. FBI didn't have any real experience investigating it. The Air Force was a new organization. And they were really looking for who was going to take the lead on this. And initially, back in the 40s, 50s, you thought, well, since it flew in the sky, it should be the Air Force. Since then, the Navy has taken a much more predominant role in this. And the reason being is, as I've said in past episodes, USOs, a lot of these things are submerged. A lot of these things seen going into water. And if you watch Missing 411, the UFO Connection, you understand the assimilation. Now, there was an organization called Project Blue Book. And it was the Air Force name for a project that investigated UFO reports between 47 and 69. There was an organization in 89 that called itself the New Project Blue Book, but we're not going to deal with that. But Project Blue Book, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Now, the FBI, in part of the Freedom of Information Act, released a UFO fact sheet. And it's fascinating. I'm going to read it to you. It says, December 1769, the Secretary of the Air Force announced the termination of Project Blue Book, the Air Force program for investigation of UFOs. The decision to discontinue UFO investigations was based on an evaluation of a report prepared by the University of Colorado entitled Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects. A review of the university's report by the National Academy of Sciences, Past UFO Studies, and Air Force Experience Investigating UFOs During the Past 2 Decades. As a result of these investigations and studies, and experience gained from investigating UFO reports since 1948, the conclusions of Project Blue Book are: 1, pay attention to this, no UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of threat to our national security. 2, there has been no evidence submitted to or discovered by the Air Force that sightings categorized as unidentified represent technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge. No, our government never lies to us, folks. And 3, there has been no evidence indicating that the sightings categorized as unidentified or extraterrestrial vehicles are extraterrestrial vehicles. With the termination of Blue Book, the Air Force regulation establishing and controlling the program for investigating and analyzing UFOs was rescinded. All documentation regarding the former Blue Book investigation has been permanently transferred to the modern military branch, National Archives and Records Service, 8th and Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., and is available for public view. Attached for your information is the Project Blue Book sighting summary for 1947 to 69. Also included is a listing of UFO-related materials currently available. Since the termination of Project Blue Book, no evidence has been presented to indicate that further investigation of UFOs by the Air Force is warranted. Friends, I can't make this up. This is in 69. In view of the considerable Air Force commitment of resources in the past and the extreme pressure on Air Force funds at this time, there's no likelihood of renewed Air Force involvement in this area. Okay. So that was written in 69. Now this is the accumulation of data that they gave. Total UFO sightings by Blue Book from 1947 to 1969. Now, 1947, 122 sightings. 12 were identified, and they were able to be identified as the moon, Mars, other aircraft, satellites, whatever. But you notice it goes from 169 in 1951 to 1,501 in 1952. Almost a 10-time increase. Then you go down to 1957, and from 670 the year before to over 1,000. And then you go from 64 to 65, and you go from 887 to 1,012. And then you go from 1,012 in 66 to just 146 in 69. So in 69, out of 146 sightings, only one was able to be identified. Yet their conclusions are, there's nothing here, ignore it, go about your work, we don't even need this investigation anymore, and there's nothing related to it being dangerous to us. So, what we know about our government today? Obviously, you can't trust anything they say, especially about UFOs. But this was really, truly a remarkable period in history. And I'm going to walk you through some more monumental things. So, Guy Hotel was an FBI agent. And he wrote and investigated many things related to the UFO field. And this is an office memo he sent March 22nd, 1950. And it was from Guy Hotel, Special Agent, Washington, subject flying saucers, information concerning. It says an investigator for the Air Force stated that 3 so-called flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. They were described as being circular in shape with raised centers approximately 50 feet in diameter. Each one was occupied by 3 bodies of human shape but only 3 feet tall, dressed in metallic cloth of a very fine texture. Each body was bandaged in a manner similar to the blackout suits used by speed flyers and test pilots. According to Mr. and then it's blacked out informant, the saucers were found in New Mexico due to the fact that the government had a very high-powered radar setup in that area, and it is believed the radar interfered with the controlling mechanisms of the saucers. No further evaluation was attempted by Special Agent in charge during the above. March 22nd, 1950. Now this was in relationship to Roswell. Roswell Airfield in New Mexico was a military base at the time, but they also had very high-intensity radar facilities in the area. Now, nobody knew what happened in that area until a rural rancher came across some things in a field, brought some home, and contacted some people in Roswell. I'll get to that in a second. August 26th, 1947. Office memo, Special Agent in charge, San Francisco, reports of flying discs. They are being transmitted herewith to the Bureau of Photostatic copies of 3 reports received from Lieutenant Colonel Blank, 4th Air Force, Hamilton Field, California, involving reported sightings of flying discs. The LA office is being furnished with photostatic copies of reports dated August 16th, 47, concerning the investigation conducted of a Muroc test flight at Muroc, California. The Butte office is being furnished with a photostatic copy of the report, which sets forth a letter received from blah, 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 Helena, Montana. The office is maintaining contact with the lieutenant colonel and will furnish the Bureau with subsequent reports concerning the observations of Mr. Blank of Sacramento, California, who has reported certain observations which he believes may involve a flying disc at Placerville, California on August 14th, 1947. Something was happening in that 46, 47, 48 time frame that was unusual. All of a sudden there was a giant blimp and people started seeing flying discs, UFOs that we would call them today. There was no rational reason for the increase. And in fact, there's no irrational reason for the increase unless there was an increase. And too many reputable people, policemen, firemen, pilots, made observations associated with these during that 40s period, and they couldn't be discounted. And even people had taken pictures at the time. Now, when this thing crashed in Roswell, very unusual things started to happen. Here is one, July 1947. W. Brazil, the rancher credited for a time with finding the nation's first flying disc, is sorry he said anything about it. The 48-year-old New Mexican said he was amazed at the fuss made over his discovery. If I find anything else short of a bomb, it's going to be hard to get me to talk, he told the Associated Press. Brazil's discovery was reported late yesterday by Lieutenant Walter Haut, Roswell Army Airfield Public Relations Officer, as being one of the flying saucers that have puzzled and worried residents of 43 states the past several weeks. So up to the time of Roswell, they had a whole series of reported UFO sightings, essentially. They called discs. Brazil related this story. While riding the range, he's on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. He's riding along 30 miles southeast of Corona, New Mexico on June 14th. He sighted some shiny objects. He picked up a piece of the stuff and took it to the ranch house 7 miles away. On July 4th, he returned to the site with his wife and 2 of his children, Vernon and Bessie. They gathered all the pieces they could find, the largest about 3 feet across. Brazil hadn't heard of the flying discs at the time. Several days later, his brother-in-law, Hollis Wilson, told him of the disc reports and suggested it might be one. When I went to Roswell, I told Sheriff George Wilcox about it. He continued, I was a little bit ashamed to mention it because I didn't know what it was. I asked the sheriff to keep it kind of quiet. He added with a chuckle, I thought folks would kid me about it. Sheriff Wilcox referred the discovery to intelligence officers at Roswell Field, Major Jesse A. Marcel, and a man in civilian clothes whom Brazil was unable to identify, went to the ranch and brought the pieces of material to the airfield, supposedly. And you didn't hear anything more about it. Lord, how that story has traveled. I was from Brazil. Now, Brazil, remember, just a ranch guy. Saw some weird things in the desert. Didn't even think much about it. Took some of the metal back to the ranch house, left it there for a couple weeks, finally brought it down and showed the sheriff. Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer at Roswell, comes out and picks it up and supposedly took it all back to the airfield. Now, this is a very, very famous photo, and the title, so what it says, not a flying disc. Major Jesse A. Marcel of Houma, Louisiana, intelligence officer for the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell, inspects what was later identified as a Fort Worth Army Air Base weather forecaster as a ray wind target used to determine the direction and velocity of winds at high altitude. Initial stories labeled it a flying disc, but inspection at Fort Worth revealed its true nature. Fascinating. Very fascinating. Because it was all a lie. It was all a lie. When a commander first stated that it was a disc, he obviously got destroyed by his commanders and said, we've got to change this. So they grab some garbage, they throw it on the floor, they put Jesse Marcel out there, and he does a song and dance about what this might be. Now, as this is going on, July 7th, 1947, 36 states report discs. Yeah, it's an article. Mysterious flying saucers were reportedly seen again today in various parts of the country, and at Spokane, Washington, a woman declared that 10 people saw 8 of the disc-shaped objects land near St. Maries, Idaho. The phenomenon has been reported by hundreds of persons in at least 36 states, including the District of Columbia and Canada since June 25th. Descriptions vary, but generally the informants agree that the objects skimming through the skies are saucer-like discs. So to me, one of the more interesting things is, what was the catalyst for all this? Suddenly. Then you have this article, July 6th, 1947, Portland, Oregon. The flying saucer mystery reached fever pitch today after, quote, I saw with my own eyes, said a veteran United Airlines crew member, Portland resident, the UAL pilot, co-pilot, and stewardess who had scoffed consistently at flying saucers said they saw objects themselves last night while flying a passenger plane from Boise to Portland. Their statements followed a day with many other Portlanders, including police and experienced flyers, and 3 newspaper men decided that they saw a silvery, undulating craft over Portland. Captain E.J. Smith, Seattle, a veteran of 14 years with United, said he observed the round, flat objects like a pancake standing on end for about 12 minutes while flying from Emmett, Idaho to a point southeast of Ontario, Oregon. Co-pilot Ralph Stevens of Seattle noticed it first. I thought it was an airplane at first, he said. I turned on my landing lights for a signal. Then it seemed to break up into 5 different objects. Okay, so stop there. They see this is right at the beginning of the entire UFO phase. So he sees a UFO out there, and he doesn't know if it's that or another plane, but making sure they see each other, he turns on his landing lights. They're super bright. All of a sudden, the object he sees out there, which is just one bright light, breaks up into 5 and scatters. That is fascinating. Why? Because that's been recounted thousands of times in the 60 years since this happened, 70 years. Captain Smith said they appeared to be flying at airliner's own altitude, about 8,000 feet, seemed to be southwest of Ontario. Another one, mysterious flying disc, appeared over Portland today. Hundreds of people viewed the strange objects in the sky, but none was able to give an exact description of the discs. Several Portland policemen who saw the discs said they could not possibly be jet planes or jet exhaust, as suggested by Army authorities. Army's always trying to poo-poo those things, and here the police are just trying to give a relative account. One of them, however, said, if somebody calls a disc meteorological phenomenon, I won't argue. State highway authorities verified the phenomena, and they were viewed from the window of an International News Service bureau. The first report of the disc was phoned into police headquarters and had all radio cars and state highway patrol cars were notified. Most observers agree that they could not tell the exact shape of the objects. Some said they looked like toy balloons going sideways. They didn't appear to be going much faster than a commercial plane. Now, it gets interesting. Because Roswell had a lot of moving parts to it. And over the years, people who weren't held to a secrecy oath would talk. And here it goes. This is a U.S. Army major hid debris from Roswell UFO crash in his water heater at home after the government tried to cover it up. This is the Sun, February 5th, 2020. Major Jesse Marcel, who was the first officer on the scene of the flying disc crash, landed in New Mexico. Same guy in the picture I showed you with all the garbage on the ground. Took material home from the crash site in 1947 and kept it in his house, according to British investigator Phil Mantle. Marcel was dispatched by Army Roswell Field, where he worked as an intelligence officer, to investigate the crash. Specialist teams were brought in to clear the wreckage and to claim by some several dead alien bodies who were flown to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. The U.S. Air Force said later the object was a downed high-altitude balloon. However, before his death in 1986, Major Marcel admitted there had been a cover-up. This is true. Pay attention. And said that he was forced to hold pieces of a weather balloon at a press conference to debunk the UFO crash story. Now, this would make me so mad. You're a highly credible person, you believe in telling the truth, and you get ordered by your superiors to go out there in front of the public, lie to them, and just say it's a weather balloon that crashed. Has nothing to do with a flying disc that your commander said earlier. Fascinating. Until now, it was not known what happened to the strange material he found at the site, a kind of metal that would spring back into shape after being crumpled, and which he said he took home to show his son Jesse Jr. Jesse Jr. was 10 years old at the time and grew up to be a physician. Now, when they said they crumpled up, it was described as almost like aluminum foil. And you could crumple it up and let go, and it would fold, unfold, and be just like a normal piece of steel. And you could fold it again, let go, and it would all unwrap and be flat with no signs and crinks in it. Calvin Parker, 64, met Jesse Marcel 3 times in the early 80s, after Calvin had his own encounter with a UFO in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Very famous UFO encounter. Calvin, then 19, was fishing on the banks of the Pascagoula River with his pal Charlie Hickson when they claimed a UFO landed nearby, and they were grabbed by strange creatures with lobster-like claws, who dragged them aboard. Huh. Gee, Dave, I think we've heard that somewhere before. The entities that engaged Mr. Higdon watched the movie Missing 411, the UFO Connection. He said a mutual friend organized a meeting with Major Marcel, who was very sick at the time, and he confessed about where he kept the UFO debris. Calvin said he told me straight up that a UFO had crashed, that the U.S. government had tried to cover it up, referring to Roswell. He claimed that the government gave out fake information about where the UFO crash site was so that no one would know where it actually happened. Yeah, they lied about it, but Brazil, the rancher, later took people out. Now, the government actually went out there and dug everything up in the area to ensure that there was nothing left behind. He then went on to tell me that some kind of special military troops were moved into the area to pick up all the debris from the crashed UFO. True. Mr. Marcel, to my amazement, was part of a military at Roswell and was the first military man on site. At first he said he was allowed to talk about what happened, but later was told not to say a word for fear that the Russians might find out. Oh yeah, the Russians. Now, Jesse Marcel Jr., the physician, I saw him interviewed several times when he was alive. Very credible. Said he could remember his dad bringing it home and talking to his mom and him about it and showing him pieces of this metal. And he remembered seeing almost what looked like an I-beam. There was a little tiny I-beam that had what he said looked like hieroglyphics on the side of it. And he also said that you couldn't, as I remember, he said it was just like very, very light, this I-beam thing. Okay, the Sun, December 11th, 2020. Jesse Marcel III and that was Jesse Marcel, the physician's now son, reveals details of his grandfather's diary. Pieces of debris were taken to the Roswell base where a team tried to figure out what they were and where it was from. According to Marcel, some beans were etched with alien writing. The grandson, Marcel said, he said there were some fibers and fiber optics that may have been from computers on the ship. When my grandfather came home with the debris, his dad, the physician, looked through it with a shining light and saw a purple light inside with a symbol of a seal balancing a ball on its nose. Yeah, let's get this right. When my grandfather came home with the debris, our dad looked through it with a shining light and saw a purple light inside with a symbol of a seal balancing a ball on its nose. What? That's pretty bizarre. Jesse added, my grandfather said, you might be the first person on Earth to look at alien writing. Meanwhile, the head of Israel's Space Command says aliens are hiding among us, but will only reveal themselves when mankind is ready. Haim Ashid, 87, claims that extraterrestrial beings have struck a deal with the U.S. government to stay silent while they carry out experiments on Earth. Dr. Jesse Marcel was only 10 years old when his father brought home this alien metal. He also brought home some other stuff, which is where we go next. If you haven't read this book, this is a must-read. The Day After Roswell, written by Philip Corso, retired colonel. This is what the back cover says. A landmark expose firmly grounded in fact. The Day After Roswell ends the decades-old controversy surrounding the mysterious crash of an unidentified aircraft at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Backed by documents newly declassified through the Freedom of Information Act, Colonel Philip J. Corso, a member of the President Eisenhower's National Security Council and former head of the Foreign Technology Desk at the U.S. Army's Research and Development Department, has come forward to reveal his personal stewardship of alien artifacts from the Roswell crash. He tells us how he spearheaded the Army's reverse engineering project that led to today's... Now, before I get into this, before this book came out, I was one of these guys that was always interested. And it always seemed like there was a quantum leap between a few things. When I was young, my dad had some very old radios that had these big bulbs in the back. Yeah, we were poor, we had the old radios, and if the radio went out, you had to get one of these big giant bulbs to plug in the back. Yeah, we were poor. These were old radios. But then it seemed like overnight, we went from these to these little tiny transistors. It was immediate. How do we do that? I always wondered. Well, it's called integrated circuit chips. Corso was given technology by various specialties in the military. And he was given them and said, take this and integrate it into society. So one of the places he went was a company called Bell, B-E-L-L Labs. And Bell Labs could reverse engineer what it was, get it made cheaply, and get it made so that it advanced society in general and military in general. And there were several other companies that he integrated items with. So, integrated circuit technology. Another one was fiber optics. There was no way in the world that anybody ever knew how to bend light. But they had the technology in fiber optics. And apparently there were many miles of this inside of the craft that crashed. And it was given to Corso, and Corso again was told, now you take this out and you work with some business and you get this mainstreamed and let's get this into society. All right. Another one was the lasers. Lasers were interesting. I actually know something about lasers because I worked for a company that designed and made certain lasers for a while. Lasers are so different depending on their power, their intent, and their design. I worked for a company that had a laser that could mark the inside of a diamond so that when it was graded by a gemologist, they couldn't see the marks inside. But when you put the diamond under a microscope, at specific power, they could see it. Now that's pretty quick, huh? Other lasers were designed to cut things, high heat, very straight line. Other lasers were meant for measuring distance. When Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, a lot of people don't know this. One of the experiments they did was they measured from their location on the moon to the top of Mount Hamilton above San Jose. Now, I'm no big whiz, and I don't rub shoulders with people, but I happen to be working for a technology company, and my boss liked me. He invited me to this social function where Neil Armstrong was at, and I shook his hand and talked to him for 2 hours. And he talked about this experiment they had to measure the distance. And I got to tell you, in my time with him, he never showed any of the indications that people do when they lie. And I mean, you got to really be studied to be able to accomplish this, or be a psychotic individual to get by and fool somebody who's looking for your indications of when you're lying. I never saw it. And just as a side note, he was one of the nicest men I've ever met. He was very polite, really a good guy. It's one of the best nights I've had in a long time, that when I met him. But they did that experiment. Now, Corso also had something called super tenacity fibers. And it was another part of the technology program that he was given to integrate. Now, at the beginning, when he came out with that book, The Day After Roswell, he was called a liar and a cheater and a faker, everything in the world. And one thing he did, he stood tall. That was a picture of Colonel Roswell when he was working at Eisenhower's cabinet. Now, he was playing at the upper reaches of government. And this is Mr. Corso when he was on the book tour. He's since passed away. Now, there's a couple things in here There's some interesting pictures and there's some cool things, but the way he starts off, I think is fascinating. And I just want to read you one short segment. And that will really, to me, it grabbed me hook, line, and sinker. It says, my name is Philip J. Corso, and for 2 incredible years in the 1960s, while I was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, headed up the Foreign Technology Desk in the Army Research and Development at the Pentagon. I led a double life. In my routine everyday job as a researcher and evaluator of weapon systems for the Army, I investigated things like helicopter armament in the French military, had developed and tactical deployment complexities of a theater anti-missile missile. I read technology reports and met with engineers in the Army, proving grounds about different kinds of ordnance and how budgeted things would work. I submitted their reports to my boss, Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau, the Director of Army R&D. What happened is that people said, you never worked with Trudeau. That was much too high of a position for you. Again, a complete lie. It was proven he did work for Trudeau. That's why this book becomes important. On the surface, especially to congressmen exercising oversight as to how taxpayers' money would be spent. Part of my job responsibility in Army R&D, however, was as an intelligence officer and advisor to General Trudeau, who himself had headed up Army intelligence before going to R&D. This was a job I was trained for and held during World War II in Korea. At the Pentagon, I was working in some of the most secret areas of military intelligence, reviewing highly classified information on behalf of General Trudeau. I had been on General MacArthur's staff in Korea and knew that as of late of 61, even as late maybe as of today, as Americans back then were sitting down to watch Dr. Kildare and Gunsmoke, captured American soldiers from World War II in Korea were still living in gulag conditions in prison camps. As an intelligence officer, I also knew the terrible secret that some of the government's most revered institutions have been penetrated by the KGB. Now, what he does is he lays the groundwork to make it believable that he was the one to be in the position to deliver this bombshell report. Now, a man named William Burns, was the editor of UFO magazine back in the day. And he worked with Corso to write this book. I think he probably wrote it, and Corso probably sat there and dictated it, and they worked together to get the wording right. But to understand how this came together, Corso had all this information. He got the okay from the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and military intelligence to bring forward and tell his story. Why? Because all of the parts of the puzzle were already integrated into society by now. So this became a New York Times bestseller, by the way, and it got copyrighted in 1997. So to think that in 97, all of those things I talked to you about were pretty much mainstreamed in society. And Corso had been sitting on this for decades. And now he comes forward and he gets ridiculed, called a liar, not true. And now, 25 years later, it's all true. Now, the problem that this poses today is, first of all, everyone wants to ignore it who's in a position to decline the UFO story. So let's go backwards. Roswell. Initially, a commander at Roswell says they have a crashed disk. The next day, the intelligence officer Marcel comes out and says, oh no, it's a crashed weather balloon. Well, just so you know, since then they've told another story. So they didn't want the fact that we had a crash saucer to come out and maybe let the Russians know that we have one. But we did. So the people in the public were sitting there wondering, well, what are we supposed to believe? You've got the people sitting on the sidelines that are going, dee, 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 dee. Oh, the government says that? It must be true. They just made an honest mistake. No big deal. But then you got the other people, the critical thinkers in the background going, no, no, no. I know that the first story that always comes out on anything big is always the most credible, which is true. And then the spin starts to happen later. Okay? So that's piece number one to the puzzle, that apparently UFOs might be real, right? Now we jump forward about 50 years until the day after Roswell, and then this big piece of the puzzle comes out. And why did I jump so fast? I jumped so fast because this is related to Roswell. Because this came out of Roswell, which is why it's called the day after Roswell. And you know what's funny about this? When this came out, nobody in the military came out and said, no, that's a lie. He's lying. No. Why? Because they gave him approval to write it. Now, why would they give him the approval to write it? Well, a lot of theories to that. Maybe it was to slowly soften the ground so that people would be accepting of the topic of UFOs. Okay. So, I briefly talked about a place called Wright-Patterson Airfield in Ohio. Interestingly, for 4 years, when I went to Ohio to watch Ben play ice hockey, I flew into an airport right next to Wright-Patterson, landed in the airport I was landing in. They had huge displays of Wright-Patterson. Of course, that always caught my attention. But Wright-Patterson was supposedly the location that a lot of these alien bodies went to. And Wright-Patterson was also supposed to be a location where there was a lot of research that was done on UFOs and aliens. But that's a little bit off topic for this. On this one, it's important for you to understand that way back in the 40s, you were getting lied to incessantly about UFOs. And Project Blue Book and the report I read you from the FBI have nothing there. We don't need this research. You know, they didn't find anything. There's no threat to our security. Okay. Now I'm bringing it up to present day. Missing 411, the UFO Connection. You watch that, right? Watch it on iTunes, Amazon, Vimeo. Or buy the DVD from me or buy the Blu-ray from me at NA, like North America, BigfootSearch.com. Go to the store. Now there, I produced a document for you that showed that UFOs were hovering above an Air Force base, Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Oh, gee, Ollie, there's no security risk there. Okay. What about Malmstrom Air Force Base? Or Minot Air Force Base? They also had UFOs hovering. That's right, they did. But, don't worry about it. They're not going to hurt us. There's no threat to our airspace. There's no threat to our nuclear codes. Even though they just shut off the nuclear codes. So ever since the UFO topic first came in the 40s, our government has taken the position that you are an idiot and that they could lie to you and pull the wool right over your head and keep you buried in the sand and you would never ever demand answers, which we haven't. And supposedly there's been presidents that have demanded answers and they were told, no, you're not going to get those. Which I have a question, teacher. Answer, can I ask a question? So if the president isn't the head of our country, who is? If the president can't demand answers on a topic, who's telling him no? I want you to think about that, because we will come back next week for another edition of the UFO, UAP, and USO class. Thanks for being here. Paulides out.